Hi, Jen.
Welcome everyone to the fourth in this series of panel discussions beyond rooftop solar. I know many of you. My name is Jen Wong. I'm the Executive Director of the Cazenovia Preservation Foundation. Tonight we'll be talking about siting for commercial solar energy generation in the greater Cazenovia area. More specifically, we'll be talking about the economics of some of the economic concerns around siting commercial solar. Before we begin, I'd like to review just a few meeting logistics with you and give you an overview of tonight's format. You probably heard this session is being recorded, and we will provide a recording of tonight's session on our website on the Beyond Rooftop Solar page for those who are not able to join us in person this evening. We have, because we're a small number, we have set it up as a regular style meeting. We do ask that you remain on mute if you're not speaking so that we have better sound quality for everyone. If your internet connection is unstable, consider turning off your video feed or dialing in on a mobile phone for getting the audio feed for tonight's presentation. Each of our presenters will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. If you have questions for the presenters as they're speaking, you're welcome to enter those into the chat, and we'll start with those questions first when we get to the Q&A. Okay. For those who have not joined these sessions before, just a brief bit of background on the purpose of this series. As I mentioned, tonight is the fourth in a series of planned events that are hosted by CPF, the Cazenovia Area Community Development Association, CACDA, United Climate Action Network, and the Chamber of Commerce. As we saw growing interest in activity with regard to commercial solar development in our area, we began to have conversations within and among our organizations, reached out to partner organizations to discuss this further, and identified some common knowledge gaps. So what we're hoping to do here is to build a collective community base of information for having conversations around this very important topic for our area. The first session was held in late June. The goal of that session was to provide a broad framework and build a common base of knowledge within our local community. And those of you who joined us for that session will recognize one of our presenters for tonight as well. We had a second session in the fall of 2021. That session focused on the geospatial data toolkit that was developed by CPF, adapted from Scenic Hudson's How to Solar Now toolkit, and that work was completed by a fellow from Colgate University's Upstate Institute. The third session in the series was hosted last week, and that focused on agricultural issues with regard to siting commercial solar projects in central New York. If you missed any of those sessions, recordings of all three are now available on the Beyond Rooftop Solar website. Today, you'll hear from three presenters. We'll look broadly at the economics driving commercial solar development, consider the ways in which project scale, incentives, site constraints, and mitigation measures play a role in project viability. This session will also outline the basics of pilot agreements, payment in lieu of taxes, HCBAs, host community benefit agreements, and decommissioning requirements. So we will, without further ado, we'll kick off tonight's series of presentations. Our first presenter this evening is Michael Frateschi. He's a professional engineer, president of TGA Clean Energy.
Thank you, Jen.
Michael, thanks for being with us.
I will get my screen share going and I'll get started. All right, is that coming through okay? Okay, perfect.
Got it now. Yeah.
All right, so my name is Mike Fortesky. I work for TJA Clean Energy, and we're primarily a solar developer based out of New Bedford, Massachusetts. And I am out of Syracuse, New York. I handle our New York market and some emerging markets in the Northeast. Tonight, I have the opportunity to talk through the solar development process and how the different costs of solar, incentives, revenue streams, how that impacts our development process as a whole, and then more specifically, screening measures, mitigation measures, landscaping, things of that nature. One note, the majority of the information that I'll provide tonight on costs and incentives are strictly New York, and more specifically, community solar in New York. There's multiple different programs, but the experience here is going to come from a community solar perspective. So around 5 megawatts AC is the typical size. This is just a quick list of acronyms and definitions. I'm not going to go through them all, but the one that I wanted to highlight here is this EPC. I'll be using that a lot. That's our engineering, procurement, and construction. It's used very frequently in solar development. And this is essentially a stage at building permit and our final design through construction. So when we refer to EPC, it could be the materials, it could be the contractor. It's a very loose term. And then a lot of these other terms will be floated around, but you can see the definitions here. So this is a quick cost breakdown of a standard solar project. So if we're looking at a standard community solar project around 5 megawatts AC, we have some costs associated with it. Site control, which is 3%, is our lease. That's the amount of money we're going to be paying to the landowner. And this is all these values are net present value over the life of a project, which is typically around 25 years. The pilot and the taxes, which are associated with a project, John will discuss more in his presentation, but that accounts for about 3% of the cost. And then interconnection, our interconnection upgrades, the developer is responsible for several upgrades, whether it's substation upgrades, distribution line, reclosers, anything of the electrical nature. We're responsible for that cost. And this is quite variable. 7% is standard or average. If it gets much higher than 10%, usually a project's not feasible. But 7% is still a pretty good chunk of our total cost. And then the development is everything from site control through building permit, engineering, legal, all the different costs associated with the development. And finally, the big chunk that we see here is our EPC. And that's, we're going to get more into EPC, but that's our hard costs, engineering, everything related to the construction of the project. To break down EPC costs even further, what we'll find is we have a lot of the hard costs here with modules, inverters, racking, MV equipment, which is medium voltage. That's a majority of our costs. And then we have some of our soft costs, which go into further engineering and legal, along with our labor. And then finally, this item here, are civil and environmental. That's everything from fencing, grading, our stormwater controls, and landscaping. Civil and environmental account for about 10% of our total cost. And landscaping is much smaller in that realm, but it's within this triangle here. A lot of these costs that you notice that are hard costs, I don't want to call them standardized because we could talk about that in a second, but most of the time we have fixed prices for modules, for inverters, for racking, and they are continuing to decrease, but there's not a lot of room for movement in these graphs. A lot of times people think of these large scale projects as being very lucrative, but they're pretty tightly wound. And then in consideration of modules like we're experiencing right now between the shipping delays and the current investigation and of some of our larger module manufacturers, it's almost doubled this number, which is making projects not feasible right now and is a reason for an industry hold on a lot of projects in 2022. So this is the standardized before COVID, I should call it. And with shipping delays, steel price increase, racking has gone up. This is just a general sense of what goes into the costs. When we look at incentives on these projects, specific again to community solar, there's an array of incentives. The first being the federal ITC, or the investment tax credit. And this is essentially a tax credit given to the owner operator of the facility who is buying and constructing it. It's current rated at 26%. So if they're going to spend roughly 10 million, they'll get almost 3 million back in tax credits. And some of these larger corporations that have heavy tax liability are going to find this to be very favorable. The ITC is a program that's being stepped down, and it's currently at 26%. It's scheduled to go to 22% next year, and then the year following 10% for thereafter. They are reviewing extending that further, considering costs haven't come down as much as they thought. And then we look at upfront incentives. These incentives are paid, as noted, upfront, basically during several milestones for construction. So at the beginning of construction, a third of it's paid, and so on through construction until we hit COD, which is commercial operation date. The New York Sun megawatt block is through NYSERDA. This was another step down program, and there was 17 blocks historically. Each block had a higher rate, and we'll dive into that in a little more detail, but they would give you a certain amount of money per watt, and they had a certain amount of megawatts allocated for each of those blocks. And as they got taken up, it moved down to the lower block. As you can see, block 17 was at 11 cents per watt, and it closed in May of 2021. NYSERDA recently released a white paper that was approved by the PSC. This program will be extended May 31st, and these blocks are going to be reallocated with funding, which will provide some feasibility to projects. And then similar to the New York Sun megawatt block, which is for commercial solar, residential solar, non-residential solar, we have community adder, which is specifically for community solar only. So if you are subscribing a certain amount of people on your facility and you meet their criteria, you can apply for the community adder. And this is the same thing. It's an upfront incentive. This is also currently fully allocated and not available, but come May 31st, this is going to be increased to a lower rate. This just breaks down the megawatt block a little further. Essentially, when we started with block 1, we were at 40 cents per watt, and that only lasted a month. But as you can see, there weren't many megawatts available in that block. And it, because of the step down program, slowly decreased down to around 2018. And I think the state entered a little bit of panic mode when they saw a lag in development, and they increased the blocks back up in block 11 and block 12 and continued to decrease that down to block 17. So this is the historical rates since 2016. EPC prices were forecasted to decrease along the same path and trajectory as this block here, and they haven't. And that was one of the reasons for this increase, and also for the new blocks that are coming in this year. Finally, when we talk about costs, we talk about the revenue of a solar project. In New York State, we use what's called the value stack, or the value of distributed energy resources, and it takes into account these different criteria and how we value a solar project. So energy value is the day ahead wholesale energy price wherever that project is located, and that changes hour by hour. The capacity value is how well a project reduces the load on the utility which the project is within. The environmental value is the environmental benefit of the product. And then the demand reduction value is determined by how many upgrade costs were alleviated because of that project, and how many upgrade costs the developer undertook to move forward. And then finally, this locational system relief value is it's utility designated. It's certain substations within the state are provided this additional fund, but it's not common, and there's not many substations readily available with this. So if we look at the calculator, I'm not going to go line by line. It's a very complex calculator, but essentially you input your project details, the load zone, the utility, what type of project it is, whether it's fixed tilts, trackers, what size it is. And when you go through the calculator and you create your output, this is the forecast of the revenue that you're projected to make over the life of the facility. So this extends 25 years, but essentially what this is saying is in year 1, if we build, we're anticipating to make around 8.7 million kilowatt hours, and we're anticipated to earn about 8.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And then that grows each year. As we know, energy prices grow, and that's forecasting that. This is not locked in stone, and it is a variable when we talk about our financing team, but it gives a really good idea of what's coming from a forecast perspective. Obviously, if you will look at this year, energy prices have gone up enough that this might be a little higher, but so all of those costs, all of those pricing, they all factor in our development process. And if we look at a very simplified route of how we develop, we essentially start with a substation, find feeders that work off that substation and move from there. And I'll go through a very brief overview of looking at different projects. And then in Phil's presentation, he'll consider it in a little more detail. So starting with substations and feeders, we have different software, but this is all located in Ohio, but it gives us a good visual of what we look for, and it's representative of New York. The blue lines noted here are three-phase lines, which we need three-phase for these larger scale projects. And then the red dot circled here is our substation. So we want to be within a certain distance away from the substation and also within the feeders. And historically, it's been within a half mile of the feeder. Try to be within 2 miles of the substation. Anything beyond that, our upgrade costs start to get a little high. That's when we run our buildable area analysis once we have that information located. So these are things like, what is the terrain and slope of a given area? Is there floodways and floodplains? Are the wetlands? We want to stay out of the majority of wetlands. Try not to clear as many trees. Bedrock depth is crucial. Habitats and historical sensitivity. These are all things we consider when doing our analysis. And when we run something like this, we're given a map that looks something like this. So these are all the parcels that match our criteria. The green meet every one of our criteria. The red don't, and the blue are questionable. So it's something that we have to look further into. So if we take into account a blue parcel, for instance, that's questionable, and we look at it a little closer, we might say, doesn't look like a bad property, maybe we could build there. When we drill in further, we find that we're covered in wetlands. We've got a lot of trees, we've got floodplains, steep slopes, so this would not be a viable project, would not be one that we'd pursue. But then when we consider a green parcel, it's a little more inviting. It looks a little cleaner, not as many trees. And when we run our analysis, all this green area is buildable area. And quite frankly, even though the program doesn't recognize it, this is buildable too. We just have to cross a stream with an approved timber bridge or something that doesn't affect the stream bed. So now when we have our parcels, all our green parcels like this, we have to start considering, well, we've got a neighbor in the front. We've got neighbors down here. We're probably going to have to include some type of landscaping in the front and along the side here. We've got really good screening along the eastern side away from the school and along the western side and along the north. And that all gets factored in. And that's when we can start our land campaign. So we go out, we get our site control, we send mailers to all of these green parcels here, we knock on their door. And when we gain site control, we can start our due diligence, which is essentially field verifying that buildable area analysis. We do things like our phase 1, wetland delineations, soil samples. We apply to the utility. We do our species and habitat surveys. And we verify that the project is in fact feasible, at which time we enter into our stakeholder reach out, which is a very important part of our process. And as you can see, we have a lot of different stakeholders, and this is not an exhaustive list. But from a governmental side, we have our AHJ, which is authority having jurisdiction, usually our town. We're going to work with the school in regards to pilot or taxes in the county with their different subdepartments. From a proximal standpoint, we have our landowner. It could be a family if the land's under a trust. There could potentially be a farmer on the land. We want to work with the farmer. Any neighbors in the vicinity. Sometimes even the landowner could be the town. We have a project under construction right now in the town of Remsen, who they use their highway department land to build a solar farm. So in this case, they were combined. And then finally, our finance stakeholders, which is our owner operator, sometimes which is the same as our financing and tax equity, and then the one that's going to build it, and obviously the developer. And the stakeholders, we have to ask questions. What do the neighbors want with screening? What does the town want? Do they have a specific species? If we add landscaping, is it going to impact the farming outside of the fence? Is it going to take away more real estate from the farmer? If we add a berm, is that going to impact drainage? Is it going to require excessive fill? So these are all questions that we have to ask ourselves around this point in the process. And this is a picture we did last year east of Albany, but essentially they had us put willows in, and it served two purposes. There's actually solar behind that screened very well, and then it also acts as a drainage measure. And then we continue through permitting, which John and Phil will cover in more detail, but this is really where landscaping is finalized and screening. And this is where the engineering for stormwater and things of that nature are accounted for. And then we get the public input and the AHJ input into what type of screening we should use. And then finally, we enter construction. So that's a very broad view of costs and incentives and how that impacts our screening measures, our development process. And when we get to the question and answer portion, I can answer any questions that might have come out of this. Thank you. I will stop sharing and I'll pass it back to Jen.
Great, thank you very much. I hope that you all are jotting down your questions for Michael, because there was quite a lot there to digest. I know I'm going to have a few at the end. So thank you for all of that. Our next speaker this evening is Phil Hoffmeyer. He's an associate professor and chair of the Environmental and Renewable Resources Division at SUNY Morrisville. And Phil, we're looking forward to hearing from you next.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you all for being here this evening. Mike set a great kind of stage of kind of the large picture for development. And so I've been working in solar energy since about 2008. And I work in kind of two areas. One is teaching a lot of solar developers, budding solar developers, how to do their job. But I also work a lot with community planners. And so that I can kind of act as a segue between the actual developers and helping towns understand what developers are looking for. I also work a lot with system inspectors. So as Mike mentioned, the AHJs, in a lot of cases, I work with electrical inspectors to teach them and to work with them on how to inspect solar energy systems. So I will try to be fairly brief here, because Mike did a really good job of kind of honing in on how systems are developed. There are a couple of things that I kind of wanted to look at, and this frame just with a couple of guiding questions. So in general, when someone mentions the word, project development, what does that actually mean from a solar standpoint? What are the scales that are important for us to think about? And how is it that site constraints affect development? And so when we just saw, ways of kind of honing in on identifying sites, and what I wanted to do is kind of briefly show you kind of a pre-development package, what that might look like, and something that kind of frames the concept of whether or not a project could begin to move forward in ways that communities can start thinking about anticipation of questions that developers will bring when it comes to like a planning board meeting or something along those lines. So when we start identifying a site and running algorithms, they pop a whole group of sites out for us. And these are kind of presupposed based on constraints. And different permitting or different development companies will have slightly different constraints that they're looking for based on kind of sweet spots in terms of development and size and scale of projects. And what we're finding right now for a lot of, I'll say, if I can, smaller distributed generation or community solar projects, a sweet spot of about 5 megawatts in New York State is kind of ideal. And then you have the utility side, which becomes much larger than that, and they have a different set of constraints. So I'm going to focus in on kind of that smaller community scale. And I'm picking a non-biased one. This is just south of SUNY Morrisville's campus. And it's one that we pursued development on several years ago. And I just revisited that real quickly 2 days ago to kind of put this together quickly as a way of showing how development might move forward. So as we begin to identify a site, I've flipped it a little bit from what Mike presented because I already know this parcel of land. So I'm going to go backwards one step and say, what are the feeders that are coming into this? So first is a line analysis set. And this is done just with a quick group of GIS tools to identify what the line sets are where the substations are, what the capacities are on each of those three-phase lines. And, we can start to identify what the hosting capacities are that are available on the site. So how many megawatts of distributed generation already exist on those lines? What's in the queue? So in some areas, you might have wind and solar competing for the same substation or the same line set. I'll say most developers are aware of the other projects, so it absolutely is a race in many cases, and to try to get the most financially attractive package with the fewest line set upgrades. So this is a really big concept. And generally there are two stages of grid analysis with a preliminary grid study. And then if that is showing promise, then, much larger grid studies come into play here. So once you identify whether or not you have the hosting capacity out of each of these substations and what those upgrade costs are going to be, again, I don't want to be too repetitive here, but that is a make or break for many projects right away, knowing whether or not you can actually make the substation upgrades and the line upgrades that are required. But let's assume for the moment that we can do that. Now, this is where I begin to start working with towns, because towns often have questions of what solar developers are looking for and kind of ways of writing ordinances that will make sense from both a legal standpoint, as well as whether or not they want to be encouraging or discouraging to solar development. Often I find that communities are encouraging of solar development, but write ordinances in such a way as to make it appear that they are discouraging. And so from a solar development standpoint, I just want to show you just a couple moments here of what we would do in a GIS database where we bring in available layers. So in this case, I've just brought in a couple. I've outlined a project area. I brought in parcel data of all the neighboring properties and just a roads layer. And once I start with this, I'll begin saying, okay, what's the general area that we have here? So when we start talking about, a multi-megawatt project, we're now in the world of acres of solar, and how many acres is a common question. And though this number is slightly variable based on site constraints, whether you have what's considered a constrained site or an unconstrained site, depending on topography and existing uses of the land. In this case, this is 24 acres. And as I start looking at that 24 acres, effectively what we're going to be doing is overlapping constraints that knock that number down to something that's functionally buildable. And so where do we get this kind of information to put into here? There's a lot here, and I apologize, this is a cluttered slide. But as kind of just a unbiased basis, New York State, as part of their overhaul of larger energy projects and the Article 10 process, has developed some regulations from the Office of Renewable Energy Siting in Section 94C of their executive law. And within there are some setback requirements for just general kinds of things. And I always start here with towns, at least as of the last couple of years anyway, because this is a good way to start thinking about how New York State has pre-vetted solar projects. So they will talk about what are participating and non-participating members, or there are lots of different words depending on which area of the industry you're in here. So I'll just stick with participating and non-participating members within a project area. So they will say things like from property lines, you must be at least 100 feet to the fence line or solar facility components. They'll talk about residences, non-residential structures, center lines for public roads, maximum heights for solar arrays. In this case, it's 20 feet that you should not exceed. Now, these are for projects that are, I'll say, between 20 and 25 megawatts and all greater, have to follow these guidelines. When you start getting into smaller projects, you're in a different permitting zone. These are still governed principally by, or I shouldn't say governed, a lot of input from towns, and the local zoning laws will kick into account here. So these are a guideline, but each town does have different structures or different recommendations for where there are setbacks. So this is really simple as a preliminary screening. So if I were a developer coming in, I'm just going to read the local zoning ordinance and just see, play a what happens game. And so I'll go in and see if they have, you know, a recommended distance from a road. I've seen everything from, you know, 100 feet from a road to 350 feet. And every time you increase those numbers, you just limit the available parcel size. Same thing from residences. I've seen, you know, 200 feet to 500 feet for solar ordinances. And all I want to do is go into a town's ordinance, overlay those constraints, and then dig a little deeper. So for instance, there's clearly a stream running through this property. So that stream is also going to have a buffer that's put around it, floodplains. Now, I'm not being exhaustive here. There might be 30 layers that I overlap in terms of constraints here, depending on topography or site or whatever it happens to be. I'm just showing a couple examples of what we would look for. At any rate, once I take all of the known constraints between the towns and environmental permitting, then I'm just going to take this into a very simple modeling exercise. Those parcels that would now be available for development, I would have to start thinking a little bit now about whether or not this project is going to move forward. So in this case, I have two parcels, they're split by a road. I want to know whether or not I can, you know, very easily get access across that road. Do I have to join the parcels? How big could the project be if I use one or the other? And again, the better outlined towns have of what their desired constraints are, the easier it is for a developer. That doesn't mean that they won't have pushback, and I'll talk about that in a couple of ways here. Developers may want to push back on certain constraints in order to make a project go forward. But the better outlined initial constraints are, the easier it is for both towns and developers to get on the same page rapidly. So the next step is actually pretty easy. Once we have known constraints, there are 3 or 4 very common modeling software packages out there for solar energy. And we'll just throw this into one of these, throw in our site constraints, and kind of run a basic model that would be pretty consistent from company to company. So as you start working with particular module, inverter, and racking manufacturers, you run into kind of consistent scenarios here. So this is just a really quick example. I didn't spend any time, you know, optimizing this whatsoever. I just wanted to fill the space. And if I fill this space, there are a couple of things that pop out to me. Part of this is on an agricultural land set. The other part looks like I might have to clear a couple of trees here and there. I've put some shading in off to the sides. And so I have some modules that I might lose from shading. But nonetheless, we're looking at something here, which is about 3.8 or 3.9 megawatts. So just about 4 megawatts. Now, if I was looking at trying to get this into that sweet spot of 5 megawatts, this is where I might start to push back on some of those constraints. Say, you know, could I get a little bit closer to the road? Is there any real problem with that? And this is where a lot of the conversation comes from development work. So as it's modeled right now, this is actually, we went from 27 acres down to about 15 acres of usable solar space. So where we are right now is about 4 acres per megawatt on the DC side. And so difference between DC and AC, I'm not going to get into this a whole lot here, but there are very particular kind of size and scales of projects that you'll see over and over again in this distributed generation space. The next straightforward step to figuring out if this is going to be a project that pencils is it goes into 1 or 2 different kind of really quick design optimizations. And it's not just solar that you need out there. You need access to the site. You have to have equipment. You have to have fencing. You have to have screening. All of these things go into, again, a very quick kind of CAD model that determines whether or not a project moves forward. So once you get through this initial development process, if it seems like we have all of our ducks in a row, if the project looks like it's going to pencil out financially, then, you know, all of the civil aspects come in, all of the electrical engineering sides come in to actually move this project through its phases of development. So what I don't want to do is get bogged down into the details. I think it's the process that's helpful for towns to understand what is kind of a developer looking for an ideal site. It's going to be proximity to substations and interconnection. I've worked a lot with the folks from the town of Fenner. And Fenner is getting a lot of pressure right now because it has a beautiful 3-phase line that runs through it. And that's why there's wind and solar pressured tremendously running through that town right now. Plus, there are the ideal quote unquote properties with relatively low slope, minimal clearing, within a couple of miles of substations, really nice distance to 3-phase lines. From there, we overlap the regulatory constraints and go through iterations of design, each one getting a little bit more extensive, and identifying what permitting challenge towns and developers have in general. So again, what we're aiming for this kind of space for the talk that we're in right now is about 7 megawatts on the DC side, which is about 5 megawatts on the AC side, which is kind of ideal for community solar generation. Again, those numbers are a little variable, but more or less, give or take 20 acres or so of usable land is kind of a common target for this space. So I'm happy to address questions, but I wanted to keep it brief so that John has plenty of time to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty parts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. And while Phil is stopping his screen share, I'll introduce our next speaker. John Lange is Chief Financial Officer at Castello, Cooney & Fearon, and he is also the Town of Cazenovia attorney. Many of you know him from town board meetings. And I see John's getting his slides up here. Welcome, John. Thanks for being with us tonight.
How's everybody doing tonight? Yeah, most people I think on this presentation do know me, and I will say thank you to Jen and everyone else. I've worked with Phil. Phil was nice enough to come and meet with the town of Cazenovia as we're working on a major upgrade, if you will, or changes to our solar law in Cazenovia, which the original solar law was adopted a number of years ago, and then through the process of experienced some of the larger projects, we received a lot of input from residents in the town of Cazenovia, including farmers and other stakeholders. And then we had invited Phil to give us comments on Cazenovia's proposed plan. And of course, we worked with Michael on what I will say, just on my own, is a very successful project that Michael's company brought to the New Woodstock area, which has been approved. And it's been revised slightly. And I'll say that when you work with folks like Phil and Michael, it's a pleasure to do these things. I've worked in other communities and we're working through, some of the growing pains of understanding the industry. It's new for everybody right now. If I went back 10 years ago as a municipal attorney, a zoning and land use lawyer, we didn't really see much. We saw more wind at that time than we saw of anything. But the solar and the solar at larger scale is certainly the hottest thing that's happening here in central New York. My office represents over 30 different towns. We also represent villages, cities, counties, and villages and cities do get solar projects, especially in central New York where it's more rural in nature here. And we've had a relatively good experience, and we try to work with the project developer to realize what they want to have happen while balancing those with what they'd like, balancing those with the rights and expectations of the residents of those communities. I also work with a lot of dedicated planning and zoning board members, and I always marvel at the fact that these folks put in a lot of time for free, and we go deep into the night, as the other presenters know, working on these projects to try to make them successful. My discussion tonight is really not going to be about the overall approval process, although I've done this presentation at the Association of Towns. I've done it for the Tug Hill Commission, and we've done it for a group out of the Hudson Valley. And unfortunately, that presentation goes about an hour and a half. So we're only going to focus on tonight a portion of this, which are the necessity for decommissioning plans, the necessity for bonds, and including decommissioned bonds and cash securities, as well as what are payment with tax agreements, pilot agreements, And one of the newer things in the last few years is this notion of a host community benefit package or agreement, which has turned out to be something that is an added bonus when these projects work out for the community. So I'm going to skip through a little of the presentation, the larger presentation that we've done. But just on this slide, I'll just remind everybody that a lot of what goes on relates to the impacts of these of the projects, and many of the designers, folks that design the projects, already account for many of the impacts that we see. Most of the communities that I work with, they have a two-step process. One is a site plan review, and the second one is a special use permit, with most focus coming in the special use permit area. I'll just kind of skip through some of this stuff. This would be something we could leave for a separate presentation in the future. But here we are on, this is a sample compliance checklist that our clients, our boards use. And that second half that's highlighted in yellow really drills down on what we're here to talk about tonight. And a lot of times we don't think about what the importance of decommissioning is. So we can have the start of a project that can be a very successful project. We all hope it will. And the engineers, both the applicant's engineer and the town's engineer, are out there trying to solve for any potential issues that may impact the environment, which most importantly might include drainage impacts. Those things can be engineered in most cases. The back end of the project really is what we want to talk about, which is we have a project that was successful, it was approved, now it's been constructed, and then we have to smash cut to 20, 25 years down the line, and it may or may not be time for that project to be replaced, upgraded, or removed. And that's where the municipality wants to make sure in the approval process that at that beginning portion of the project that there are appropriate security measures in place. And by the way, this is no different than any other large development that a town or a village might get into. Even if it's a large residential subdivision, there are always securities that are in place to make sure that a project is built properly and maintained properly, and in some circumstances that it's taken down properly. And another good example would be a cell tower. So 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started practicing law as a land use attorney, the hot topic were cell towers, and everybody in the world didn't want a cell tower because it was going to ruin everybody's view. And now if we look today, they're everywhere, and in some ways they're ubiquitous. I don't know if most of us notice a cell tower unless it's in a terrible spot. And most good boards will work with a developer to make sure it's placed there properly. And I would say the same for solar, that most good boards will find a way to make sure that the project will blend in with the natural landscape and form. So how do we address what happens when the project needs to be decommissioned? And one of those things will be decommissioning security. And in order to have a decommissioning security properly in place, we also have to have a plan. So the decommissioning plan, which addresses the actual decommissioning process, also will outline how it's going to be funded. It starts with a detailed cost estimate. The developer's attorney, someone like Michael, will prepare a decommissioning plan on behalf of the developer. It'll have a number of sections, and I think the example I used might have been one of Mike's, which was a good one. And it'll go through a number of factors of how decommissioning will take place, when it'll take place, what will the triggering factors be. So one of the key things is someone has to calculate what a decommissioning cost will be to take the project down. And the developer will provide us with an estimate, but then that estimate, and this is so the residents know this in the area, that they are confirmed by the town's engineer. And it's important to have both the developer's engineer review those numbers and then have the town engineer review those numbers. Most of the decommissioning plans will require complete removal of the solar project, with a few exceptions. And the most common exception would be an access road into, say, a farmer's field. Oftentimes a farmer will tell us up front that depending on the location of that access road, they may wish to keep it for various reasons, because it makes life a little bit easier for them down the line when the project returns to farmland. I'll use farmland as an example because 99% of the ones I've dealt with have been generally farmland. Other key components in these plans would be discussion about the restoration of the green coverage and certainly erosion control measures. Typically with a project that we approve or our board approves, we have a stormwater maintenance agreement that goes on file, is recorded against the property. That's a very important agreement that should be done. And it does get recorded in the county clerk's office. And it's typically recorded against the property that's owned by, in this case, or some cases, a farmer, but it'll be signed by both the owner of the property and also typically the solar developer. And then other issues that get discussed are, how do we know when there's going to be decommissioning? And we define abandonment in most of these agreements. Sometimes it'll be triggered because there was a failure to complete the project within a certain amount of time. And other trigger might be that it's not in use for a certain amount of time. And that can be negotiated with the developer. But typically what we do is we put that language in our ordinance so that there's no question. And I can't remember as Phil or Michael said, the first thing they do is they review the regulations. And when they know what's expected, it makes it easier to discuss it with the board, and they can plan their project around those expectations of the language in the code. So as an example, some of the laws would make construction to be completed within the 12 to 18 months from the approval itself. And if it goes past that, typically what will happen is they'll reapproach the board and say, hey, we need more time for this. And as long as there's a reasonable excuse, most boards will work with that developer. If they've approved the project, they'd like to see the project completed, but there also has to be a time limit. So everybody has a reasonable expectation of what's going to happen. One of the things we make sure we put into these agreements and in the plans is the right of the town to enter the property to conduct the decommissioning activities if the developer cannot do that for some reason. There's always the potential for a bankruptcy. I have not seen that yet. I have not personally had to be involved in any decommissioning. Not too many places have. These are new projects. They last 20 to 25 years. So as long as they're constructed, we're probably not going to see a lot of decommissioning activities, for at least 10 or 15 more years down the line. And as our boards know, we are very much involved in negotiating the language for some of these documents. The planning board or the zoning board will be involved in adopting conditions for some of these components. So here's a decommissioning plan, and I was right. It's Mike's, and it's a good one. So this one's already been approved by the town in concept, and I've worked with TGA's attorney, and they smartly put together a very good agreement. We did have some comments, and they happily changed those a little bit. So we do have a nice sample agreement in this presentation, and it does cover all the items that I was just discussing. And this one is going to be recorded in the Madison County Clerk's office. Now, decommissioning bonds. Now, this is the thing nobody thinks about, but keeps me awake at night all the time. And that's true for cell tower bonds, and it's true for highway construction bonds, and now it's true for renewable energy security for me. So there's a lot of things that keep a municipal lawyer awake at night, and not the least of which are these securities. Decommissioning bonds and security. So I already mentioned that these projects can go up to 40 years. The technology is changing, and that does raise an interesting question about what will happen when the technology changes out entirely. But these are a huge investment for these developers. So they have a great interest in making sure that these projects are very profitable for the longest period of time. I suspect, depending on what that technology is, they will replace these components as they need to be replaced. And the bonds themselves will be, the security itself will be in three forms. And the best for me is cash. Cash is king when it comes to security, the money that stands behind the decommissioning. If we have cash, that's wonderful. But that's a big ask. You're asking a developer to post $250,000. In one case, I had one where the decommissioning amount was, I think it was $750,000. That's a tremendous amount of money to place in cash and give over to the town. We love it if they will do it, but we understand that's a big ask. So now we look at the next best thing, which is typically a long-term surety bond, which is backed by a real financial institution. And the key to that surety bond is how long will it be in place? And that's something that has to be reviewed and negotiated between the attorney for the developer and the attorney for the town. A third option is what's called a letter of credit. A letter of credit is really a pile of cash that's sitting in a bank, and the bank provides a standby letter of credit saying, we have this developer's money, it's enough money to cover this, we're going to hold on to it, and here's our letter of credit saying that we will give you this money if any of these agreements are violated, and there's a procedure and some notice and so on for that. So the order of what we like the best is cash, and then the surety bond, and then finally the letter of credit. With regard to the bond, we want to make sure that the bond company is a very strong financial institution, and we have a great resource to check in on that, and we'll look and make sure that these companies are not fly by night. I haven't really seen a lot of that with most of these companies. You'll recognize them; they're indemnity and surety companies. If we're dealing with these bonds, we want to make sure that they're written in a way that ultimately lasts for the life of the facility. And that's, excuse me, and that's something that's really important to the town, to make sure that that bond is going to be there 20 and 25 years down the line. So one of the things we don't like, if we're the town, would be a bond that's only good for a year or 2 years or 3 years. I think right now, the way the town of Casanovia's new law reads is that the minimal amount of the length of time for the bond, non-cancelable, no recourse, is 5 years with either an automatic renewal or a provision that says it will be renewed 6 months prior to its expiration. And the reason we ask for that is because I'm not going to be around forever. The code officer is not going to be around forever. Somebody's got to keep an eye on that bond. These projects are long-term projects if they're working properly, and we can't be in a position where we're exposed and that money's not there to properly decommission that project. So we're very careful with the language of that. And again, you know, TGA is another good example of one that's really worked well with the town. There's a sample of what a decommissioning bond might look like. I already mentioned the engineering estimates. A couple factors that come into play that we got to keep in mind is that when we value what it's going to cost to decommission a project 25 years down the line, we got to consider inflation. Of course, we've all seen what's happened with inflation now. So who knows how those numbers are going to change. But the other thing that a lot of people don't think about is, if for some reason the project developer is no longer in the picture 20, 25 years from now, it's time to take down the project, and the owner of the property, this is the underlying leaseholder, or excuse me, the lessor, if they're not around or not unable to take the project down, then the town is going to use that money from the bond or the cash. And at some point, it may be determined that that has become a project that the town has to pay prevailing wage on. And we don't know how that's going to play out yet. So we do want to make an adjustment in those amounts to make sure we cover prevailing wage. So that could drive up that cost. I'm going to shift over to the pilot agreement. And the idea here is that New York State, a number of years ago, passed a law, New York State Real Property Tax Law 47, which makes these renewable energy projects exempt. So they're exempt from real property taxes, but they also have a provision here that allows a municipality to request and negotiate a payment in lieu of what the taxes would have been through an agreement called the pilot agreement. Now, the pilot agreement language is it's set forth actually in that 487, and part of this law says that no pilot agreement can exceed 15 years, but it also says that the pilot payments themselves cannot exceed the amount of taxes that would have paid on the property without that exemption. So the municipality can't hit a solar developer with a gigantic tax bill by demanding a pilot. It's got to be equal to or less than the amount they would have had to pay. Yeah, I haven't really seen a lot of pushback on it. Typically, it does come in under that, sometimes substantially. If the town or village is really trying to incentivize a municipality to, or a solar developer to bring those projects, they're going to work with that company to make sure they have a viable, economically viable project. And again, it also helps take some of the sting out of that exemption. So the municipality does want to receive some monies, but it also doesn't want to scare away the developer. And again, as I said, the 487 drives this entire process, but you can also include in your local law itself. And I know New York State is currently looking at these issues. So I think we're going to see some additional state regulations on the smaller pilots. It was mentioned earlier that the 14Cs and the old Article 10s, the state basically took over a lot of not only the siting process, but a lot of that other portions of it, including the pilots. There's just an example of what another municipality has for their pilot language. And this one basically tracks what the state requires. And then this is Casanova does the same thing. But I do want to point out in Casanova is that we've added this other item, which is the notion of the host community agreement, benefit agreement. And this is a real great incentive. And a lot of the solar developers will provide for this upfront. And we've had good luck working with them on the host community benefit agreements. I've done a number of these in places. And the beautiful thing about the host community agreement is typically it's a direct negotiation with the town that is physically hosting the project. Most people know that when you look at a tax dollar, when you talk about the school, the town, and the county, the town gets the crumbs of a tax dollar. The school gets by far the most, in average of 78 to 80%, sometimes 70% of a tax dollar. The county gets over 20%, and the town might get anywhere between 15 to 6% of a tax bill. The host community benefit agreement allows for payment to the town that will help the town address, what they have to deal with by hosting these projects. So it's a great thing for the town. And I've seen them come in a different array of packages. Some are an upfront lump sum payment. Some are run just like the pilot agreement, which is over, say, 15 years at a certain amount of money per megawatt. The schools have also been offered host community benefit agreements. And I've seen some solar companies pay for a school project. It could be a new set of bleachers for the gym. It could be something for the music program. And I think some of these solar companies are getting very innovative in what they'll propose for this. Now, it's not a requirement. They don't have to do it. It's not a state requirement. And I'm not going to go too much through what the NYSERDA has placed out there for what they believe are appropriate ranges for pilot agreements, but you can look here, you can look at National Grid. I believe I have the most recent one here. So the $1,700 per megawatt's the low end, according to NYSERDA. $5,100 is the high end per NYSERDA, in their opinion. I've seen them higher than this. I know Oneida County has an IDA, and they just came out with a schedule for pilot payments that's shocked me. It was basically twice as much as what I've seen in the past, and that's a very early program. I'm not sure how it's being received yet. And again, remember, with a pilot agreement, it is a split between the town, county, and school district, and it does make for a difficult negotiation, because the town, the county, and school need to get along to come up with a three-way agreement with the solar company. Oftentimes the school district will break away, and the town and the county will work together, and the school works out its own deal, and the town and county work out a deal together quite often. And then there's always the option, if they like it, any of those taxing jurisdictions can opt out of that exemption. They could say, well, we're not going to do that. We just like to tax these things like anything else. Now, I will say there's some new regulations and information that are being provided to assessors, and a new calculator for how the assessors can assess solar projects, which is different than most other things. And we're just wrapping our brains around this at this time. And so one of the reasons you would want to opt out is because you'd like to see the tax revenues. But I have yet to have a municipality say that they want to opt out of 487. But I do see it, and I see school districts do it a lot in order to get negotiation leverage. They'll opt out, and then they'll opt back in after they negotiate the pilot agreement. And then I also want to acknowledge Stacy Maris in my office, who worked extensively on this presentation. And I'll thank everybody, and I'll wait for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I'd like to thank all three of our speakers, Michael, Phil, and John. And at this point in the evening, I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience. So John, if you want to stop your screen share, and we'll go back to a speaker view, gallery view. And any questions from members of the audience for any of our speakers this evening? You're welcome to use the hand raise feature in Zoom, or enter your questions into the chat, or just, I think we're a small enough group, you can unmute yourself and ask your question verbally.
So Jen, can you hear me okay?
I can, John. Did you?
Okay. Nobody jumped forward, so I just want to mention I've got a couple board members that are listening in on this, and they've been through this process. And anybody that wants to offer their opinion, they can. I'm just curious to know what any of my board members, how they felt the experience was going through one of these projects. And I know the only one they have experience with is with Michael and TJA, but I'd be curious to know how any of my board members felt that whole thing went, because I know there was concerns at the beginning, and I know that we ended up with an approval, a good approval at the end. So I don't know if Gary or Dave or anybody else would like to say anything about that. Jerry's on there too. Jerry, you're not even muted.
I know, I just unmuted myself. First of all, it was exhaustive. And second of all, we had one of our board members who spent an incredible amount of time shepherding the project through, and did just an outstanding job. If I'm ever appointed by our chairman for one of these projects, I will immediately resign.
And Jerry, you'll remember that with the TGA process, the planning and the zoning boards really, there were boots on the ground. There was a site visit involved. We went out there with Michael. We walked up to where it was. People were looking at the various vantage points and asking the developer to see if they could fit the project a little more seamlessly into that landscape. And I think TGAA and their folks did a great job of listening to the planning and zoning board and working out really favorable locations. And I was impressed with that.
Yes, I would agree with you, John. I mean, I think Mike and his crew did an outstanding job. And yeah, climbing the hills was a bit of a challenge.
Those were steep.
They sure
Yeah,
were.
they were steep.
Yeah.
I think the site visit was invaluable. Just
Yep.
The scale of these projects can be much bigger than people realize. And when you can actually get on the ground and you can see the general limits of the project, it's invaluable.
And I'm not sure whether it was in this presentation or the one earlier that I attended, where they talked about providing views from different aspects, projected ideas. They were invaluable. I mean, we went probably as far as a couple miles away from the site, and they provided us with some views of what the screening would be and so on.
Great. We do have a question in the chat from a member of the audience. Lori Dudley writes, are there any regulations for decommissioning the solar panels to be recycled? Lori, do you want to unmute yourself and expand on that question a little bit?
So there are new, facilities for recycling the panels, and I think it's going to be a sort of, it's a big issue because there's a lot of panels and you don't want them to go to the dump. You want them to be recycled, and I'm just wondering how the plans are going so that the communities don't necessarily do the easy thing and bring them to the dump, but actually have a plan for recycling them. We're talking about thousands and thousands of panels.
Yeah, I mean, we might even be approaching millions at this point, even with just within the state. But the state itself is looking at both a recycling program and a rehabilitation program, where if the majority of the glass and the aluminum is not recycled, they're actually looking at rehabilitating the panels for future use. And if they can do that and bring the panels back into a new system, that'd be best case scenario. But I know that NYSERDA and the Public Service Commission are very fervently looking for a recycling program, and it's been underway for about 1.5 years now.
Do you think it will actually be accomplished though? Will it be part of the decommissioning rules that you can't just bring those things to the dump?
I do think so. I do think it will be. Yep.
Bill, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to say I don't know because we're in the United States. If we were in Europe, it would be a no-brainer, right? So if we were in Spain right now, upwards of 92% of solar panels are recycled when they're decommissioned. But they look at costs differently than we do in the United States, right? Anything that is deemed expensive is generally kicked out. So what I think is really important is that solar panels have the ability to be recycled. Right now, they're listed as toxic waste, but that has to do with the way in which the waste stream is classified. And so part of this is solar panels to be a little bit more appropriate so they're not considered a toxic waste. And then I think the next jump is getting them to have recycling as part of the decommissioning plan. But like our recycling stream in general is nuts right now. And so I don't know that solar panels are different than other things that are being recycled. But what I do know is in terms of like appliances and construction, they have the highest recyclability of almost anything that I'm aware of right now. Again, up beyond 90% of solar panel components are recyclable in other parts of the world. So it's this big thing in the United States, but nowhere else.
And what about Cazenovia new law? Is there anything in the law about recycling?
No, there's nothing in the law about recycling. That becomes a very difficult challenge for the local town to try to regulate that. And that's why if you look at other types of materials, the state of New York has really taken the lead, or the federal government's taken the lead on saying, here's where these things are going to be disposed of. But Cazenovia as a local community doesn't really have a great position to be in to tell developers what to do with those panels afterwards.
It's a little scary. I mean, I'm very pro solar, but that is a little scary.
Mm-hmm.
I see another question in the chat here. Julie writes, I'm playing catch up. I apologize if this was already covered in previous sessions, but is there a specific site being considered? Are multiple competing solar companies being considered? Are the relatively easy to address energy savings measures being assessed and changes made first? Examples, LED lighting, water efficiency systems, etc. So they're kind of a few things combined there. I guess first I'll say that to address some of the initial questions, there are multiple. This particular speaker series isn't about a specific project per se, but it is designed to just build a common base of knowledge in the community so that we can have some familiarity with some of the nuances as some of these project proposals do come before our municipal review boards, and as we start having communities weighing in on things that there's community members weighing in on things that they're seeing happening in their neighborhoods. Any of our panelists want to address some of these other pieces? In other words, are multiple solar companies involved in some of the projects here or that we're seeing locally or regionally, and are relatively easy to address energy saving measures being considered as well? Maybe, Sean, I don't know if someone, a representative from the town, want to talk about.
Yeah, so what I can tell you is that because my office represents a lot of municipalities, one of the hot items to this question, one of the hot items going on in a lot of villages is LED conversion lighting inside village settings. Most towns don't have heavy duty lighting systems unless they're a lighting district. So I do see a lot going on with LED light conversion going on. And it's been, from what I can tell, it's successful, and it's presented as being successful as a big money saver too, but there is an upfront investment that like a village has to do. And some of the agreements that we have to negotiate are super complex, but we do work with National Grid and some of these other, I think they're called Real Term, these other companies that will help incentivize LED lighting conversions. And I think that's a good thing. So that is happening, but like, for instance, the town of Casanova, I don't know if we have any, I don't think we have any lighting districts. And of course, a lot of that LED stuff can happen right in our homes. With regards to competing solar companies, we have seen a proliferation of a number of companies that are out there. Some are very, very large companies. Some are based in the United States. Some are not in the United States. We're dealing with a company out of Canada that has been doing municipal projects. And what they do is they package up dozens of smaller projects. And these are kind of neat. So they'll do stuff that's under a full megawatt, and they'll locate them on places you'd love to see them, which is an old brownfield or out at a highway garage or in the back of a sewage treatment plant. And somehow they're able, and I'm not, you guys, the other guys like Phil and Mike, you guys would know the economics of these projects, but they're really interesting projects. And I think that's they're a great player. The one company I'm dealing with is in Canada. They're nice people. I think because the pandemic hit, that one of the project I was working on has been held up for 2 years, but I think it's got a heartbeat right now. So that's an interesting question. And yes, there are many different companies out there that are trying to lead the way with this type of energy.
Another question from Lori. How does the company decide the underplanting of the panels? Is a landscape architect involved? How many communities are mandating pollinator-friendly plants or future plans for agrivoltaic use? So the first part of that question, Michael, would you like to address how are you determining what's planted underneath your arrays?
Sure. A lot of times in New York, the solar bylaw or ordinance mandates some form of local or native pollinator on the site. Casanova has one specifically, which is not something we're opposed to. The pollinators provide an aesthetic to the project that helps us with the view shed. It is a little more expensive, but it also, we can choose local pollinators that are slow growth and minimizes our O&M costs. So we do get landscape architects involved on these underplantings, and then we also get them involved on the screening measures that are placed outside the site. But again, specific to the Casanova project, as part of our plans, we actually have a very specific seed mix that has to be used. And that was reviewed extensively by the planning board and zoning board and the town engineer. So yeah, that's our experience.
And the second piece of that question, this maybe Phil or John, you perhaps can comment. In our, regionally in our central New York area, how many communities are mandating pollinator-friendly plants or future plans for agrivoltaics? What are you seeing are the trends?
Most. So even if I extend that out to the United States right now, pollinators are a hot issue everywhere. And so it's not just solar energy projects. I have research grants with New York Power Authority under every utility right away. Every right away right now is, moving toward pollinator friendly habitat. So it's a very common, and it is a fairly expensive. And one of the things that's really interesting about pollinator habitat is to maintain it is actually challenging. So it's not just the seed mix that you put down. You have to be very consistent with which times you come in and do mowings. So they're normally, it's like a twice a year mowing, but you have to do it at very particular times. Otherwise, it just gets outcompeted by, non-native vegetation, and, it takes over. So it's really challenging. One of the other issues is making sure that, you have the proper, distance between panels, just to put it simply, to make sure that your ground coverage ratio is correct for whatever plant mix you're going to come in. And in fact, that issue becomes more important when you start doing agrivoltaics, whether that's planting companion, crop species, or whether you want to invite sheep in to do grazing. Those things are all common, and they will become more common with time. Each time you do things like that, it increases risk, though. You are allowing more people inside of a high voltage fence. And I am of two minds there. I am all for agrivoltaics, but I am very weary about people coming into high voltage areas with, minimal training and, concerns of animals rubbing up against things. And there's some really big challenges there that over a 25-year life of a project, you don't want someone to get hurt. And so to me, it's a fine line that has to be very carefully mitigated. I'm glad I'm in academics and I don't have to worry about it from John's perspective or from Mike's perspective in terms of how do we do this safely and actually integrate it into the fabric of the community to hit all of those different goals. It's easy to talk about it academically.
And I'll just put a point on what Phil was saying. So I'll tell you from my perspective, we've just recently, in the last year or so, we've been asked to draft a whole bunch of updates to people's solar laws. Every single municipality has asked for the pollinator friendly language in their ordinances.
Great. Next question from the chat is from Jerry. How do consumers benefit? How do they participate?
I think there's a couple different ways with community solar specifically. The first and most obvious is subscribing to the community solar facility, and you'd get a guaranteed savings on your electric bill, and that's usually roughly 10%. There's also the benefit to the local community with a stabilization electrical grid from the facility, on top of increased tax revenue, whether it's via the pilot or the new standardized assessment model that the state is pushing on to assessors. And that is active this year, but it's still being fine-tuned. And then finally, these host community agreements, like John mentioned, they're popping up in a lot of different towns, and that's providing different avenues of revenue for whether it's the town, the school, whether it's an education contribution agreement. Some towns that we're talking to want something for the life of the project. So there's different ways that a consumer could benefit off of these projects, and outside of even just the landowner receiving those lease payments.
Next question is from Julie. How about the effects on birds? Are there any issues with that to be aware of? And if so, are there strategic ways of reducing the impact? Any of our panelists?
I think Mike and probably Phil can address it better than me, but I'll just mention this because I didn't think to say it out loud. But at the beginning of every project, the zoning and planning boards are charged with making sure they understand all of the potential significant negative environmental impacts. And there's an entire section under the secret review that deals with animals and birds and that. So that has to be reviewed, and the engineers and the other professionals will present that information to the reviewing board, so that must be taken into consideration. But I'll let these guys give you a better idea.
Yeah, just from experience, the local pollinators that are being planted are definitely helpful to the bird habitat. We found that the birds tend to seek shelter underneath the trackers or the fixed tilt systems or the shade, building nests. We've seen pretty positive output, especially when we're always seem to be compared to the wind industry, which I know birds are a big problem with that. But I think there's some positive effects for the bird population, and as John mentioned too, through the seeker process, we're also examining endangered species and things of that nature to make sure that we're not impacting them.
Oh, there's another thing which hasn't been asked yet, which I think is one of the biggest issues, and I think it was part of a prior presentation, which is the impact on agricultural lands. And one just quick note was I had a project out in Oneida County, and interestingly, my planning board there got a letter back from Ag and Markets, which was the strongest letter I've ever seen from Ag and Markets. But in that particular case, and that wouldn't always be in every case, they actually told my planning board, and as strongly as they could, to convince the developer to adjust where they were going to lay out the panels, because there were certain important soils that Ag and Markets felt should be avoided, since there were other soils, or there are other lands that on that area of control that they could put it, and that worked out nicely, and the developer moved it, and that was a great thing. So we do get input from Ag and Markets when those notice of intent are sent out to Ag and Markets.
Well, John, you kind of took this exactly where I was going to go. I had a couple of questions that I think those of you who are on last week's presentation might have an interest in. Michael, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. You gave us an overview of the steps for reviewing potential project locations, and you talked a little bit about the land campaign process and when you get to that stage of investigation. What process, to what degree is TGA looking at agricultural soils and the quality of agricultural soils as it's reviewing potential locations?
It's not necessarily a site-by-site basis, but there is some instances where if we're viewing a specific substation, that town may say X amount of percentage ground coverage on a certain amount of prime or important farmland. That comes into play. But when we are viewing properties, we're trying to understand how big is the parcel, how many acres of farming is underway. If we take a quarter of it, is it going to be detrimental to the surrounding community? Casanova is a specific example. We had, and I'm still working with the farmer that farmed that property, even though he didn't own it. We have a very good working relationship, and we were able to provide him additional lands to farm on the property. We were able to remove some fences that he wasn't able to farm before. We're adding some land and smoothing it over and providing drainage. And then we locked him into a long-term lease with our landowner that we're working with. So it is crucial. Being a solar developer, I think many times comes with the connotation that we're anti-ag, and I think it's very far from the truth. It's just as stated in the American Farmland Trust. I saw a few times, a lot of times the ag land is closest to three-phase, closest to a substation. It's open, it doesn't require tree clearing, which can be sensitive. So there's that hand-in-hand approach. So approaching the farmers on the land, evaluating the agricultural impact is something that takes a heavy play into our development process.
Any other questions from members of the audience? I might close out the evening by asking you to look into your crystal balls a little bit. There are a couple things that came up in some of your presentations this evening. Michael, for example, you were talking about the rule of thumb in terms of distance from a substation as far as kind of what's feasible and what's not. So half mile from a feeder and 2 miles from a substation is sort of the current kind of standard there. Do you see that changing, and how quickly as some of these prime areas are being developed and developers are looking for additional opportunities?
I think it's going to change, and I think it's going to change quick. We're seeing a lot of states jump onto the solar bandwagon, I'll call it, especially in the community solar, and as such, technology is growing quickly. we're moving into things like smart inverters that help out a lot with our interconnection upgrades and provides different frequencies of when we're injecting that power back into the grid where maybe certain upgrades aren't necessary anymore, and it can lessen the cost on that end, which would allow us to expand even further. And then beyond that, I mean, I've seen on the residential scale, I'll give you, for instance, a few years ago, you know, when we were speccing panels on a project, a 300-watt panel was considered very large. Now in the same footprint, I mean, we're talking 800-900 watts. Maybe I've even read a residential manufacturer doing a 1 kilowatt panel, and it's not readily available, but it's coming very quickly. And I think that's going to shrink how much we need to put out. Our production can still remain high. We can provide some of these agrivoltaic strategies with the perpendicular or the vertical panels, higher panels. So I think the increased technology is exponential. It's not linear, and it's really going to impact our industry over the next couple of years.
if
Phil,
I could-
oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
I was going to ask you to look into your crystal ball on this one. You talked about that 5 megawatt sweet spot for kind of community scale solar in our area right now. Do you see that changing, and how quickly?
I think it's already changed. So the 5 megawatt sweet spot is one that's simply an economic and incentive cap. And that is a particular sweet spot for some particular companies. When you look at what New York State is moving toward, with especially the most recent draft of the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. One of the things that's really important about that is, and this gets back to an earlier question, is this is changing incredibly quickly. So as nuclear is phasing out in New York State, we have some of the oldest nuclear infrastructure. We're moving towards electrification of heating and transportation, while we're doing, you know, upgrades and energy efficiency gains. There's huge impacts for battery storage, which means the transmission and distribution network has to be upgraded. So what we're going to see is a much more, it's a movement away from centralized power to decentralized power. So we're going to have more transmission lines, if for no other reason, to alleviate congestion. When Mike was talking about some of the value stack components, a lot of those costs and values have to do with where you're putting energy back into the grid and alleviating congestion. And that's just going to happen more frequently.
Great.
So this gets into a lot of social justice issues, but it's happening, it's growing.
Great. Thanks, Phil. And one last question for you tonight, John. Actually, less a question than if you can give the group a little status update on where the draft solar law for Cazenovia stands and what are the next opportunities for the public to comment there.
That's a great question, and the answer is at the next town board meeting, we've now extended the public hearing out, I want to say, to 3 sessions so far, and we had that special session where we covered what all the upgrades were going to be. So the next meeting is the second Monday of May, and I anticipate that we have what's probably going to be the final version of the law. And if the board members are happy with it, there's a high likelihood it would be adopted and implemented. But I also tell everybody that asks me this, that in my mind, and with this particular board, they've shown a great willingness after they've adopted something to have an open mind and, you know, getting it out on the road, testing it out. And if there's some bumps, they'll bring it back in the shop and tweak it. And I think this board would do the same thing. And again, everybody's in this learning mode right now with these types of projects. So I have every confidence that the town board in Cazenovia will adopt a very good law, and then they'll find out what the best parts are and what some of the parts that could use improvement are, and they'll make those improvements.
Well, I think that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you for everyone for hanging in until 8:30. We ran a little longer than I thought we might tonight, but really great presentations from all 3 of our panelists tonight. So thank you all for that. I know I certainly have learned a couple of things this evening as well. Also like to thank our co-hosting organizations for working with CPF to help identify those knowledge gaps and build a framework for this series. That would be the Casanova Area Community Development Association, CACTA, United Climate Action Network, and the Chamber of Commerce. Thank you. And finally, thank you to our audience members tonight for being engaged around this important topic and participating constructively in the conversation here. We will get tonight's presentation posted up on the website in the next day or two. And again, thank you to all three of our speakers, Phil, Michael, and John. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks,
My
Jen.
pleasure.
Good night, thanks.
Bye, guys.